why don't you ask about Harold Bloom and Helen Vendler? Not just a general. Do you have any? Has anything ever bothered you specifically about them?
I mean, yeah, I mean they're bad, and despite the fact that they're bad, there's a massive amount of praise that's heaped upon them, which is troubling because they're bad. But on the other hand, whenever you see criticism of Harold Bloom, it's never written from the perspective that it ought to be written in. For example, Noam Chomsky went on a famous kind of rant of all people against Howard Bloom, but it had nothing to do with the actual criticism itself. It had nothing to do with the way that he has no idea how to evaluate art. Chomsky was just discussing it from the modern perspective that you can't say that there's these that great works simply because they're not accessible to everybody. So even among his critics, there is nobody that is taking the correct perspective. Nobody's arguing against Howard Bloom.
Harold Bloom.
Howard Bloom from the turf that they should be arguing from. It's always about something else. It's always about the fact that they've taken offense. It's always about something demonic. He's too up there. He's too critical. He has too strong opinions. He's not
Yeah,
subjective enough. That's nothing to do with the actual criticism itself, and that's a
yeah.
problem.
Well, let's just pick up on that because your rant is a good intro, and I totally agree with it. The best evidence of it is what was the famous book that he had around the turn of the century where he was doing on the poetry. I forget the name of it. Um,
He had a few on the romantic poets.
yeah,
He
but
had
the,
like the great books. I think that's his most famous one, like
yeah,
the
yeah,
great.
right. The Western canon.
Yeah,
That's the one.
yeah.
Um, and that's a terrible book. I mean, it's a terrible book. I mean, there are bad critics, and I remember I think I wrote a review of Jacques Barzun. Barzun is a bad critic. He's more or less a social slash uh, historical critic about society. Bloom is even worse on the arts for a lot of the reasons that you had stated. But probably the thing that sums up why he's such a bad art critic, and we can talk about Helen Vendler and Camille Paglia as well. But the reason Bloom is such a bad art critic is he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. I remember in one of his chapters, he compares Sylvia Plath with Anne Sexton, which everyone does, so it's kind of a cliche, but it's justifiable. And then he compares them both to Maya Angelou, on which there's absolutely no comparison, because Plath was a master of word selection. She was a master of sound. She was a master of dramatics within her poems. She was a master of setting little scenes and expanding them and floriating them outward. By contrast, Anne Sexton was looser. Anne Sexton's best poems had a more conversational tone. Sometimes they were poorly broken in terms of enjambment. And then you have Maya Angelou, who it's even you can't even really call her a Hallmark card writer because she was sub that level. And yet, a whole essay, a whole chapter in the Western canon by Bloom is spent exactly on this fucking thesis that the three of these women are somehow uh, in a league with one another, and it's just insane. And it shows he doesn't know a damn thing of what he's talking about. Helen Vendler, on the other hand, is someone who at least has uh, a good sort of MLS Chicago Manual of Style understanding of classical poetic terms and what they're supposed to mean and whatnot. Bloom doesn't. Um, Bloom is one of these phonies along with Joseph Campbell, and we can talk about that son of a bitch. I mean, I'm actually going to be doing a Dan Schneider video interview about Kurt Vonnegut towards the end of the year, and Kurt Vonnegut had the best dismissal ever of Joseph Campbell. His whole bullshit theories about storytelling and whatnot, and Vonnegut said, "Oh yes, wasn't that the man who came up with the idea that all stories about the hero gets into trouble, the hero gets out of trouble?" And that's basically the whole. Joseph Campbell built a whole fucking career out of this one meager premise. And he's been celebrated by morons like that Bill Moyers ever since. And it's just really insane when you think about it. But um, getting back to like Helen Vendler, Vendler was someone who understands poetics to a certain degree. She just doesn't understand what makes something good. She could tell you what enjambment is. She couldn't get in and tell you what makes for good enjambment. She could tell you what symbolism is for and how it should be used or whatnot. She couldn't tell you or give you an instance of good symbolism if it bit her on the ass. So she's a different kind of bad critic than Bloom. Bloom is a total incompetent. Helen Vendler is sort of a competent incompetent in a sense. And then you have someone like a Camille Paglia. Camille Paglia, for example, is actually a pretty good social critic. I agree with many of her theses on male female relationships, about the hypocrisies. I read something, someone, I don't know if it was you or someone else, forwarded me something, an email regarding that Emma Sulkowicz thing, that the phony rape girl. And I think Camille Paglia had written something, if not directly, but tangential to her and also on Bill Cosby, and she was spot on. And I'm sure a lot of these men's rights advocates are big Paglia fans. But Paglia knows nothing about the arts. She's someone who is totally wedded to her own likes and dislikes, and
Yeah.
and she will. I've read 5,000 or 6,000 word essays in the Atlantic or New Yorker or those types of magazines where she'll defend the most egregious types of bad art for no particular reason other than she simply likes them. And so, you know, it gives you a kind of spectrum of what's wrong with arts criticism when you talk about the total incompetent dead white male, Harold Bloom, to the sort of, wannabe Helen Vendler types, to the hit and miss Paglia types. And then again, like I said, you have someone like a Joseph Campbell who's a total fraud.